Hello and welcome back to Followers of the Casper Journey. Today's video is going to be a little bit different. We're going to be getting into some charts and technicals, and today we're going to be attempting to answer the question, will Casper decouple from Bitcoin? So this is potentially going to be quite a controversial video because that is quite a out there theory, and it goes against the norm and goes against everything that we know, but I think it could also be one of my most important videos to date. So before we get into it today, guys, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you are interested in some of the indicators that you see on the screen now, don't forget to check out my Patreon, where we use these indicators in a private trading community to try and catch some of the highs and the lows of Casper's cycles. So the general premise of this video and the idea that Casper will decouple from Bitcoin comes basically from the Casper power law. Now, for those of you who don't know, most of you probably do, but Casper follows a power law. It is the only asset other than Bitcoin to follow a power law. Out of the other 13,000 plus different cryptocurrencies, none of them follow a power law. And a power law basically is a linear relationship on a log chart, where you can see that the cells here represent 1 year each, and as time goes to the right, the cells get smaller and smaller, which, unlike on a log linear chart, indicates diminishing returns rather than exponential growth. And now Bitcoin has followed this power law since 2011, and it has been the most accurate model at forecasting Bitcoin's price ranges and the allowable prices that Bitcoin can go into, as well as forecasting both tops and bottoms. And so far, it has been incredibly accurate on Casper as well. Now this is actually a slightly old chart. There is a more up-to-date one, but in this most recent dip of Casper, we perfectly bounced off the lower power law line and are now looking like we are getting into the next phase of the 8-month cycle, which is the major cycle. And what do I mean when I say 8-month cycle? Well, so for those of you who don't know, Casper has a very predictable and very regular 8-month harmonic, where every 4 months there's a peak of sorts, but the first peak is a larger peak than the second peak. So this first peak here is referred to as a major cycle, and the second peak here is referred to as a mini cycle. So it goes major cycle, mini cycle, major cycle, mini cycle, major cycle, mini cycle. And then based on this model and based on the growth of this model, it indicates we are going now into the next major cycle. And the major cycles are generally a significant all-time high from the prior cycle. And so far, this model and this 8-month harmonic has been playing out incredibly accurately for Casper. And so based off those two things, the unique 8-month cycle that Casper has, bearing in mind that no other crypto asset has anywhere near that level of sort of cyclicality or predictability other than Bitcoin or other than altcoins that follow the 4-year cycle, and no other asset follows a power law other than Bitcoin or Casper. And so based off that, based off the unique 8-month cycle that only Casper has, and based off the unique power law that only Casper and Bitcoin have, it stands to reason that instead of Casper following Bitcoin's 4-year cycles, it may actually follow its own 8 to 4 month cycle. And now, if this does happen, that would be absolutely revolutionary, because everything else follows the 4-year cycle and everything else follows Bitcoin into the 4-year cycle. So no other asset would have achieved this before and achieved being able to decouple from Bitcoin cycles and start trading on its own, and essentially trading as a new asset class, or a new asset class within the crypto space at least. So first of all, we're going to look at some arguments against this and why this is unlikely to happen, and then we're actually going to look at the evidence that implies that this may well happen. And the first bit of evidence that this can't happen is something called the global liquidity cycle. So the global liquidity cycle was introduced by someone called Michael Howell, and the basic premise of it is that relatively predictably, every 4 years, there is a rise in liquidity and a decline in liquidity. And what we mean by liquidity is basically the amount of debt and capital that is available in the system. And when liquidity is going up, so the available amount of debt and capital in the system is going up, then asset prices generally follow this pretty spot on. And when they are going down, asset prices also follow that. So they generally go down with the decline in liquidity. And so as you can see, we are actually basically at the bottom now of this next liquidity cycle. And based off this, the fact that we are at the bottom of the liquidity cycle and liquidity is forecasted to rise over the next 2 years, that indicates that we are going into a bull run for risk assets, so stocks, crypto, and real estate. And the Bitcoin 4-year cycle has lined up incredibly well with the global liquidity cycle. So many people believe that the liquidity cycle is the primary cause and factor in the Bitcoin 4-year cycles. So as you can see, when the amount of liquidity is rising, denoted by this green area on the graph, that also correlates incredibly well with the Bitcoin 4-year cycle, or the Bitcoin bull run. And then the Bitcoin bear markets correlate incredibly well with the decline in liquidity. So based off that, there are many who believe that the halving has a minor effect within the Bitcoin 4-year cycle, and it is mainly driven by liquidity. And if that is true, then that is a argument against Casper decoupling, because Casper can't really escape the liquidity cycle of the economy and can't escape these sort of huge cyclic forces that drive all asset prices higher, and then when liquidity is declining, drives all asset prices lower. So this is evidence that Casper won't decouple, and Casper will follow the rest of the crypto market and go into a long extended bear market when the liquidity cycle is reaching its peak and going into a decline. And another argument against the idea of Casper decoupling is that this is not a new idea. There are people and there are sort of communities that have predicted that their token and their asset will decouple from Bitcoin, and that this time it's different, and this time this is such a big step forward in technology that it's going to now ignore the rest of the market and just experience its own unique adoption curve. So, this is not the first time that someone has sort of proposed that their own asset will decouple from the rest of the market. So, bearing that in mind, that people have said this before and it has never come true before. No asset has been able to decouple from Bitcoin before. When we look at, on the bottom is Bitcoin and on the top is the total crypto market cap. They are incredibly well correlated. They almost look like the same chart. So, that is evidence that crypto follows Bitcoin, just solely follows Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is the driver of cryptocurrency. And even looking at the total market cap of crypto, excluding Bitcoin, which is the top one, versus Bitcoin, so, the price movements of Bitcoin are not included in the upper graph there. The correlation is still incredibly accurate and incredibly similar. So, it has never happened before where a cryptocurrency has managed to decouple from Bitcoin and decouple from the rest of the market. They all trade together. They all trade within their own cycle, within the 4-year cycle. And everyone who has had the idea that their crypto will decouple and will buck this trend has been wrong in the past. So, it is important to sort of understand our own biases and understand we are coming at the market with a particular bias. But bearing that in mind, there is evidence out there that Casper could potentially decouple from the rest of the market. And that's what we're going to look into now. So while there is evidence that the liquidity cycle is, certainly a huge factor within the Bitcoin 4-year cycle, the 4-year cycles have also aligned almost perfectly with the halvings. So on the screen here, you can see the first halving. After the first halving happens, then Bitcoin goes into a huge bull run. After the second halving happens, Bitcoin again goes into a huge bull run. And then after the third halving, Bitcoin went into another huge bull run. And by the looks of it, the pattern is continuing. And it does make sense because the halving represents a 50% supply shock in the new supply of Bitcoin coming onto the market. And assuming demand stays the same, then basic economics implies that, when demand stays the same and supply drops, then price has to adjust to account for that supply and demand. And while we can't ever really predict the demand coming into Bitcoin, or, it's difficult to do so, we can predict pretty nicely the supply, or at least the supply coming from miners. So it does stand to reason and align with basic economic theory that the supply shocks that occur within Bitcoin are at least a big factor within the 4-year cycle. It's actually possible that Satoshi knew about the 4-year cycle and he planned on lining them up so that it would have an even bigger effect, and it wouldn't just be the liquidity cycle and it wouldn't just be the halving, it would actually be both of them acting on the asset, which is potentially why we have seen such volatile and huge bull runs from Bitcoin. So if you believe that and you understand that the halving likely has an effect on the 4-year cycle, then it stands to reason that the reward reduction cycle of Casper will also have an effect on Casper's price and on Casper's behavior. So for those of you who don't know, Casper doesn't have a 4-year halving, it actually has a monthly 5% reward reduction. And this 5% reward reduction equates to about one halving every single year, every 12 months. So the equivalent supply shock that Bitcoin experiences every 4 years, Casper will experience every year. But instead of it being one huge supply shock, it's a sort of gradual decrease in supply. But assuming that demand keeps up and, continues coming into Casper, then the function of the supply decreasing and demand either increasing or staying the same implies that price will have to go up to account for this. And so while Bitcoin is in its bear market, assuming that history repeats and it's roughly a 1-year bear market and 1-year accumulation phase, Casper will have actually experienced the equivalent of 2 halvings worth of reward reductions, which, if you believe basic economics and assuming that demand stays roughly the same, then this will more than likely be a huge driving force for price to continue going higher even while Bitcoin is in its bear market. And now, as you can see, Casper obviously has drawdowns and pullbacks, so it's not just up only, but the general trend is Casper goes up, and it goes up in these cyclic 8 to 4 month cycles. And so my theory basically is that Bitcoin experiences these 4-year cycles in part because of its 4-year halving and in part because of the liquidity cycle. But I personally think that the halving has as big of an effect on Bitcoin's price action as the liquidity cycle does. And so based on that logic, and based on the fact that while Bitcoin is both in its bear market and accumulation phase, Casper will have experienced the equivalent of 2 halvings, or roughly a 75% reduction in emissions, then that will be a huge factor driving prices higher. Now, obviously Casper will have dips and, a bear market during this time, as it has throughout its whole life cycle, but I think more than likely this 75% reduction in rewards will cause Casper's price action to look very different to what we have come to expect in a normal 4-year cycle, and different to how any of these other altcoins will react. And so Casper is actually one of the least correlated assets with Bitcoin in terms of daily correlation of returns. So in this chart, I took a selection of the top 50 cryptocurrencies and compared their daily price movement in terms of returns to Bitcoin. And of the selection that I did pick, Casper was the least correlated with Bitcoin. Ethereum, not really surprisingly, being the most correlated, with Binance Coin second. But even compared to something like Tau, which is also a very new project, Casper was the least correlated out of all the other assets. So that is very interesting, and that is evidence that Casper is potentially something different and will potentially buck the trend of what we expect to happen in a bear market. And we can actually see that on the charts. So this is a graph of Casper versus Bitcoin, with the price of Casper adjusted slightly just to see the daily movements slightly better compared to Bitcoin. But so when Bitcoin was in its bear market, Casper was continuing to put in all-time highs. So I don't know, most of you will probably been around during this period, but the amount of fear that was sort of around in the markets at this time, there was no other projects setting all-time highs, or at least setting consistent all-time highs. Whereas Casper, even when Bitcoin was nuking and capitulating at its very lowest, Casper was just ignoring it and continuing to rise despite the fact that Bitcoin was in its bear market and at its lows. So Casper, although it is a new project and was very low market cap at this point, was just continuing to set all-time highs regardless of what Bitcoin did, while every other altcoin was in its capitulation zone and setting bear market lows. And the correlation has remained relatively loose up into this Bitcoin bull market. So, while there is correlation when Bitcoin pumps, Casper does also pump at times. There are times when Casper will pump with Bitcoin not really doing anything. So for example, in this sideways move here, Casper was going, not parabolic, but it was setting new all-time highs while Bitcoin was moving sideways. And then also, on the contrary, if anyone who's been involved in Casper for this period, while Casper hit its all-time high when Bitcoin was sort of, looking like it was moving higher, but then this little dip here in Bitcoin represented the all-time high of this Casper miner cycle. And while Bitcoin put in this huge move and most other alts were pumping like crazy here, Casper was just moving down during this entire time. So while most other alts were following Bitcoin and following its price action very closely, Casper was kind of doing its own thing, and it was a huge source of complaint for people who had just gotten into Casper. A lot of people on X were sort of complaining and saying, Casper's, it's terrible, what's it doing, it's just going down, the rest of the market is moving up. And that to me shows that Casper is the least correlated asset out there, at least within the top 50. I'm not talking about a micro cap meme coin that's just been released, but of the, large cap altcoins, Casper sort of just does its own thing. And so bearing all that in mind, the fact that Casper follows its own power law, Casper follows its own 8-month cycle uniquely that nothing else follows. When we look at what the Casper rainbow chart, which is logarithmic regression, not power law, but it's a similar-ish function, predicts for Casper. So it would predict, roughly a $3.50 peak in the bull run. And then assuming, Bitcoin peaks in sort of late 2025, we would also expect all other alts to follow it and go into the bear market with Bitcoin. And I think we can also expect that with Casper. We can expect Casper to peak here and then have a significant drawdown. But assuming that it continues following this rainbow chart and sort of crawls its way back up, the latest point at which it could hit its new all-time high would be in early Q2 of 2027, which is when Bitcoin and the rest of these alts should be in their accumulation phase. So, if Casper does continue to follow this rainbow chart and continue to follow the power law, then it would be setting new all-time highs in 2027, which would be, completely unheard of for an asset of that size at that time. By that time, Casper's likely to be around a 100 billion market cap asset. So unlike the last bear market when it was, basically still a micro cap and it was pumping, that's possible because micro caps kind of do what they want. But a huge $100 billion asset at that time, for it not to follow Bitcoin and for it to follow its own cycles and its own adoption curve, it would be pretty revolutionary. But the evidence of the power law and the rainbow chart indicate that that is a possibility. And it's not just the power law and 8-month cycle that indicate this, but it is actually what the charts potentially tell us. So when you compare Casper to other altcoins, its behavior is very, very different to what we expect from crypto and what we are used to. So for example, if we get up Solana, and we look at Solana's first cycle, Solana had basically parabolic action all the way throughout its first cycle, whereas what we see on Casper is diminishing returns. So if we compare the returns of Solana, in its first move, it put in an 800% move. And then in its second move, from bottom to top, it put in a 5,000% move. So Solana, during its first cycle, was just speeding up. There was no diminishing returns that were occurring within Solana. And the same is true with every single other altcoin. So Ethereum, for example, during any of the cycles it's been on, but especially its first cycle, it had parabolic action all the way throughout the cycle. So its first move, it put in a 2,300% move, and then in its second move, it put in a 6,000% move. So again, during the first cycle, Solana and Ethereum were speeding up. And the reason they experienced this is because that basically is what Bitcoin experiences. So, when you look at the full history of Bitcoin, we see that it has diminishing returns and is, following that power law and following this sort of 4-year cycle, with each cycle putting in slightly lower returns than the last one. But during the actual cycles of Bitcoin itself, the price action speeds up. So for example, the first real move of Bitcoin in the 2017 cycle was around 300%. But then if we look at the last move of Bitcoin, it was 800%. So the returns were continuing to be extremely large all throughout the cycle, and they were actually increasing as the cycle continued and continued to put in higher and higher returns. So this fundamentally is why all of these other altcoins look nothing like Casper, because as the cycles progress, they follow Bitcoin and they put in higher returns throughout the cycle, and they go off into, you know, what we consider to be a blow off top. But this, again, is not at all what we are seeing with Casper. So Casper, within its 8-month cycle, experiences the same thing. So, you know, in the sort of first move that it'll put in, that was a 50% move there. And then the next move here was a 100% move. But then the move after that, if we go from the bottom of the dip, was a 360% return. So within one of Casper's, 8 to 4 month cycles, it will experience the same sort of thing that Bitcoin experiences in its own cycle, and put in accelerating price action with higher returns as the cycle progresses and as the cycle continues. But overall, when you look at all of Casper's cycles, over time, they are putting in lower and lower returns. So, you know, the returns of Casper's first cycle of 2,500% were much, much lower than the returns of, say, the last cycle, which was 350%. We can sort of expect that to continue going forward, indicating that this cycle coming up for Casper into the major cycle will more than likely be less than 350%. So as you can see, all of these other altcoins, they follow Bitcoin to a T, and they follow it into its parabolic price action and into its sort of, blow off tops, which you can argue is essentially just parasitic behavior. They are not really experiencing their own organic adoption. They are basically experiencing Bitcoin's adoption and the hype that comes with Bitcoin's adoption and with Bitcoin's bull markets, and people, piling in to try and make as much money as possible and profit from these bull markets. But, in terms of organic adoption, is anyone actually using Solana as their savings technology and as their money? Or are they just simply using it for, interesting DeFi applications, but also fundamentally for gambling, which of course there's nothing wrong with, but that is not really organic adoption. Whereas, Bitcoin clearly has experienced very organic adoption all the way throughout its life cycle. And I believe that all of these other alts have just been basically feeding off that and feeding off Bitcoin and taking advantage of Bitcoin's own organic adoption. Whereas Casper, I believe, is the first ever asset after Bitcoin that we are actually seeing experience its own organic adoption and, its own sort of unique adoption curve. And that is why I believe that Casper is basically a completely unique asset. And it is a new era in this form of cryptocurrency where we are going to see it decouple and behave in a way that we are not expecting at all and that nobody else is expecting, because so far the only other asset that we've seen that has experienced that organic adoption, at least in my opinion, was Bitcoin. And another thing that is quite important to sort of consider in this theory is the market structure of Casper. So in Casper's market structure, it has these very sort of rounded accumulation zones, which is just, a beautiful, typical accumulation that you would expect. And it experiences these quite consistently. This last one has been the perfect example with a fairly symmetrical, rounded sort of structure here. And so that is why I don't really consider these moves on Casper to be dips as we sort of know them within crypto. But I think these are more equivalent to the accumulation zones of the Bitcoin bear market. So, if we take Bitcoin as an example, when we sort of zoom out and look at the 2017 cycle is a very good example of this. So this, this bear market of Bitcoin, that is the perfect example of a, textbook crypto accumulation, starting off relatively quickly and selling off quickly, and then slowing down into, a gradual bottom, and then a reversal into a gradual rise, and then again accelerating into the next peak. But so when you consider the sort of overall structure of the Bitcoin bear markets and then compare that to, say, a dip on Bitcoin, well, the dips are very different, because a dip is more of a V, basically. It's more like that, whereas the accumulation is more of a sort of rounded, symmetrical bottom. So that is why I don't really consider these periods and these areas of Casper to be what we know to be a dip in cryptocurrency. These, to me, are more an accumulation and more comparable to a Bitcoin bear market than a sort of normal typical dip that we see in cryptocurrency. Again, no other asset has these very typical accumulation of a sort of rounded structure within their bull markets. And so it's because of these things, the power law plus the 8-month cycle plus the completely unique structure and sort of behavior and price action that we see from Casper, that I believe it can potentially hold the lower line of the rainbow chart during the bear market. And that would only account for around, assuming we break the upper band a little bit, that would only account for around a 75% decline, which would be actually a very mild bear market for a cryptocurrency. More what you would expect in a new cryptocurrency when it's going into its first bear market would be a sort of 95% decline. That is what typically we have seen. But because Casper doesn't look like it's going to have a blow off top and looks like it has, predictable and healthy diminishing returns, still extremely high returns, but diminishing, more than likely it doesn't have to have this huge sell-off in the 2026 bear market. And so what I could see happening, let's assume that this here is the 2025 peak, just for ease's sake. So we come up and then we come down again with the rest of the market, and then for the 4 to 8 month cycle we actually bounce. And then potentially, because of the selling pressure and because there will more than likely be an immense amount of selling pressure, we fail to put in a new all-time high in the next 8-month cycle. But then as Bitcoin is really just going into its accumulation zone, I think that is when Casper is likely to surprise a lot of people and rocket to new all-time highs. And I think that'll catch a lot of people very off guard, because most people are used to the playbook by now of huge bull run and then huge 2-year bear market with the accumulation zone. So Casper doing this would certainly be bucking the trend and basically would catch a lot of people off guard, and a lot of people would be sort of scrambling to get back into their positions by that point. And it does stand to logic, because now that institutions and sort of large buyers and big capital is involved in cryptocurrency, more than likely the cycles are going to get a lot less predictable and a lot less obvious and a lot less cyclical, because it would be nice if Bitcoin just followed a 4-year cycle all the way throughout its history and all the way into the future. But it's a little bit too well known now, and if it's too easy to make money, then everybody is going to be using it. So then more than likely the entire crypto market is going to become a lot harder to navigate going into the future. And decoupling from Bitcoin would be the scenario that nobody really expects to happen. As someone in my Discord said, this is a blood sport. We are all here to make money, and fundamentally not everyone can make money, at least not in the short term. So often it will be the scenario that nobody is expecting which will play out. And again, just looking at the sort of market structure of Bitcoin, the bull markets and the bear markets are generally sort of roughly equal in sort of size and severity. And Bitcoin having this long extended bear market then allows it to go into this huge blow off top bull run. But because Casper doesn't have the same sort of behavior and instead experiences these minor bear markets and sort of mini accumulation zones, but then also never gets anywhere near as extended from the fair value as Bitcoin does, and doesn't go into these huge crazy blow off tops, then it also stands to reason that it doesn't need to have as bad of a bear market. So that really is why I think Casper is the best contender to decouple. And I believe that we are basically seeing the birth of a new asset class with Casper. And really what we are seeing here is a cryptocurrency experiencing real organic adoption as money, and the first one we have ever seen since Bitcoin, and the first crypto that is not just riding the Bitcoin hype and is actually able to sort of stand up on its own 2 feet. And while a lot of people will say, Casper is still predicted to reach sort of 50 to 75 billion market cap this cycle, and that's an extremely high valuation for it to reach in its first cycle, well, it would make sense that Casper would experience faster adoption initially than Bitcoin experienced, because we already have the playbook and we already know that it is possible for a asset to experience, organic, huge adoption. And so the sort of level of uncertainty associated with Casper compared to Bitcoin when it was at a similar market cap is much lower. Obviously, Casper is a lot less certain than Bitcoin is comparatively, but when you compare them at a similar stage in their life cycle and a similar market cap, then Casper is sort of a lot more of a confident bet that you can take, whereas Bitcoin was at that point still highly experimental, and nobody really knew if cryptocurrencies would actually survive and would actually continue to experience adoption. So it does make sense that Casper would initially experience faster adoption than Bitcoin experienced, because we have that playbook, and we know that a cryptocurrency likely is going to be the future money of humanity. So we really do have Bitcoin to thank for that. And so this is kind of what I envisage potentially could happen in terms of Casper experiencing its own decoupling and experiencing its own adoption curve. So obviously everyone's expecting Bitcoin to go into a sort of huge blow off top in 2025 and then go into a bear market. And if that does play out, I have no doubt that Casper will follow it down initially and will have a significant, roughly 70%, 75% haircut and decline in price. But then I think more than likely, while Bitcoin is in its bear market here, Casper will actually be going on to set new all-time highs in 2027. And I think that'll catch a huge amount of people off guard. But there is a lot of evidence that points to Casper being different and potentially being able to buck the trend that we are now so accustomed to and has become so expected. And we only have one example of an asset following a power law, and that's Bitcoin. And Bitcoin during its time followed it perfectly and continues to follow it perfectly. So of the very, very limited examples that we have to go off, when an asset does follow its own power law and its own unique adoption curve, it will continue to follow it into the sort of foreseeable future. And that is why I feel very confident and very comfortable holding, a lot of Casper, because I believe that basically we are seeing organic, real adoption with Casper, and we're not making money off a hype cycle. We are making money off seeing, the adoption of a new asset. And the adoption of a new asset class, and more people sort of switching over and realizing that Casper is the real deal and starting to use it as their form of money, which I essentially am. I don't really see Casper as an investment or a trade. I see Casper as my form of money. Obviously, it is very new and very emerging, and there is more risk associated with it compared to something like Bitcoin. But based off everything we know, off all the fundamentals and all the technicals, everything aligns incredibly well for Casper. The amount of evidence that points towards Casper being different, I think, is a huge amount. So thank you very much, you guys, for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and don't forget to check out the Patreon if you are interested in joining the community and trying to take advantage from these 8-month cycles and trying to profit from them and increase your bag of Casper. But other than that, thank you for watching, and until next time, cheers.